What was it really like to fight in the Civil War? We tend to think of the Civil War as either very dramatic or romantic and sentimental. However, for the actual soldiers fighting, the Civil War was terrible. First off, it was very tedious. Secondly, the soldiers were often sick. And third, they were all over-medicated. So the first point is that fighting in the Civil War was tedious. So when you were recruited, you're sent to the training camp where you drill all the time. You were forced to wake up early and you're constantly being inspected. Like your barracks are being inspected and like they look at your guns all the time, so you're always being watched. August V. Kotz describes life at the camp of a soldier. He says, quote, "A soldier's life is made up in waiting for the critical moments." So basically, as he says, most of the time you're not fighting. So the soldiers would just sit around, like smoking their pipes. Other common activities were gambling, playing cards. Sometimes they would also have dog and rooster fights. Some of the well-off soldiers would also bring their servants who would like serve them tea or stuff because they had nothing to do. You could also do artwork or sketching. Even the food at the camps were pretty boring. One officer describes his meals. So for breakfast and dinner, they would have potatoes, salted meat, some dried vegetables or fruit, and a biscuit. They would use their bread to clean up the food tin and then eat the bread. Supper was basically the same, but they didn't have meat or potatoes. And they got coffee, but they had to pay extra for the milk and for the butter if they wanted it. Second point is that most soldiers in the Civil War were sick all the time. So if you think about it, there's thousands of young men together. They didn't have good hygiene, horrible smell. There was lice everywhere. It was very dirty. The only time they could clean was like when they were at a lake or river, so they would bathe themselves then. Soldiers often came from small communities, so they didn't have a good immunity because they hadn't been exposed to very much. So viruses and infections were very common. Most people in the first few months of being a soldier, they would have at least a cold. It was also a new climate, and as aforementioned, the food wasn't very good. Theodore Garish says, "One of the most disastrous features of the gloomy situation was the terrible sickness of the soldiers." One example is during the Battle of Chancellorsville, 5,000 Confederate soldiers were missing. They weren't in the action. So what happened is, I think the doctor was absent, and they all decided to give themselves vaccines for smallpox, because obviously they didn't want it. It was pretty horrible. But they didn't have the right implements, so they took pocket knives, clothespins, and even rusty nails, and they cut themselves. Then using the nail, they would poke an infected person with smallpox and take the pus and stick it in their wounds. And so it kind of worked, but they'd also give themselves tetanus, so yeah, it just wasn't great. The third point is that soldiers in the Civil War were over-medicated. So opioids were very common before the war. Doctors would prescribe laudanum, which is an opium drink. That was common to prescribe to Southern women. Doctors gave large doses of this to the soldiers. So basically everyone got addicted, which did help them to relax when they're in battle and help them to go to sleep. But unfortunately, after the war, they all went home and they're addicted to opium. But thankfully they could order it online and not online in the newspaper, and then they get it, so they didn't all die. Alcohol is also common in diagnostics, so you basically could drink alcohol if you wanted to, I guess. The officers could just ask the doctor for opium or whatever they wanted to medicate themselves, which accounts for some very strange behavior and for some of the officers because they were high. There was also a guy named William H. Taylor who was an assistant surgeon. So he decided a quick way to diagnose his patients would be when he's like on his horse riding along, the soldiers are walking by, and he would take his opium powder and like pour it on his hand, and he just like hand it out for the soldiers to lick off his hand as they go past. So that's not that smart. And also very strange. Another thing he would do was he'd go up to soldiers and he'd be like, he'd say, quote, "How are your bowels?" Unquote. If they said that the bowels were open, which meant they had dysentery, Taylor would give them a chunk of opium, which would help, but now they are also high. If they answered that their bowels were closed, he would give them mercury, which was very poisonous, so not good. Very dangerous thing. So, in conclusion, people think that the Civil War was either very romantic and sentimental or very glorious and dramatic. However, fighting in the Civil War was terrible. Life for the soldiers was very tedious. There wasn't much going on most of the time. Secondly, most of the soldiers were all sick. And thirdly, everyone was over-medicated and crazy. Thank you.